You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel and Katya Barch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. We are back and we're talking about personal practice tips. I think this is a really important one if you're listening to this as it comes out live. We just kind of passed all of the enthusiasm of the new year. And, I think anytime after January is a good time to talk about this. And really anytime. It's a good topic anytime. But I think when we start to get into February and beyond in the year, we kind of start to dip into the long haul of our practice of how we make routines and how we find a resource in our practice that we can tap into. And so I think having some tips and support along that realm is really important. And, we all find ways to access that. We'll talk about some ways that have been particularly helpful and important, I think, with a personal practice for us in particular.
And I think this is a topic that brings up a lot of misunderstanding because it's something I've mentioned in class. I'll often teach a pose and then I'll give students a few breaths to sort of do whatever feels natural, to kind of rinse out in a way that feels good for them. And I remember commenting in a class once, to me, this is the seed of your personal practice. When you take a moment, even in a guided practice, to tune in and go, okay, how did that feel? And now what do I need? And afterwards, one of the students came up to me and said, you have this idea that we have a personal practice, but I'm not spending an hour on my mat at home, that's for sure. And it really struck me that that's not what I meant by personal practice at all. So I think there is a misunderstanding out there that people think they've got to take the curated class experience and then mimic that all on their own. And that's a personal practice. And I'm hoping today we talk about what we think a personal practice actually is and what it's for and dispel some of those misunderstandings.
Yeah, definitely. Right. I think that's often our goal here is to dispel some of the myths. But I think let's start with why is it important? I think is a great place to begin. Like,
why are we always talking about it?
Yeah, and especially as teachers, I think there's always, and we're always talking about it in our teacher training, our 200, our 500, our 1,000-hour teacher training, the importance of a personal practice, because I think it's a big part of teaching as well. So we'll start with, why is it important, Rachel?
Yeah. I think every person in teacher training has been told repeatedly, it's so important that you have a personal practice. Teachers have to have a personal practice. But often the conversation doesn't go beyond that. So I do think a lot of people leave teacher training with this generalized anxiety over, I'm supposed to have this really fancy personal practice. I know I'm supposed to have it. I don't know exactly what it is. So why do we think it's important? It's because yoga is not a theoretical practice. It's an experiential one. And as a teacher of that practice, you need to have experiences to draw from. So you need to know, what soothes you when you're anxious, what helps that cranky shoulder when it's feeling irritated. How does it feel to transition from this shape to another one? What helps you feel more steady when you're standing on one foot? All of these little tidbits of personal information really are what you share as a teacher. And they, I think, should be drawn from what you're feeling in your own body and in your own mind on your mat and in your life.
And to me, this is where yoga is really valuable. And really, I think in comparison to both science and medicine, which are very much often, and I'm just going to generalize, but often more cookie cutter. And, even in the best research study, we know that there are always people who don't respond to those treatments. And so I think what's so precious about yoga is the nuance and the ability to be able to individualize it. And it really does require that personal practice. I know you mentioned coming out of teacher training. I mean, I remember back in the 90s coming out of my teacher training and feeling a lot of pressure. I mean, I do remember one where I went, there was a lot of pressure to have an hour-long meditation every day. And I was 16 at the time, so an hour felt like 12. But an hour at least once a day, if you were doing it right, you were probably doing it twice a day. But I had a lot of, I internalized that. We're all, we all have a little bit of this kind of perfectionistic tendency in us probably. But feeling like there was this rigidity for me around what it had to be in order to be a yoga teacher. I had to do this thing, and kind of like what you're talking about. And we stress this a lot, the importance of a personal practice. But for me now, the importance of a personal practice is in getting to know myself, getting to know how my body responds, being able to adapt to these changing needs of my body, both over a week, over a decade, over a lifetime. And I think for me, the importance of having a personal practice is that experience. Like you said, again, it is limited. Our students can have very different experiences than us,
Mhm.
and so we also then accrue the experience of teaching and talking and connecting with people to recognize that there are many other experiences than ours. But the only true experience that I can have is my own. And so, in order to teach, I think what this does for me as a teacher is it takes me from teaching from my brain to teaching from my body and my heart and my experience, so that I don't have to overthink things. I'm not like constantly ruminating and thinking about things, but I'm teaching from my experience and knowing that that's limited, but I can at least draw those similar people toward me, people with similar needs toward me, or similar ways of seeing things. Or, as a teacher, you're not going to please everyone, but I have to have that personal practice to teach from. It's so
Yeah.
essential.
I love that you've drawn out there two things. Firstly, straight out of teacher training, there is that real tendency to be sequencing in our heads and teaching in our heads and trying to think of the list of cues and then trying to think of the perfect way to transition from this one to the next one. And setting the braininess aside and returning to what keeps you coming back to your mat, what helps you moving from this shape to the other, grounds you in your own breath and your own body. It's a much more calming place to teach from. I also love that you pointed out that while we're teaching from our own experience, that won't be the experience our students are having. And so we do have to remember to keep a little bit of spaciousness around what's helpful for me is X. See if it's helpful for you. So I love that that isn't the Bible, what you feel, but it's a really grounded place to teach from. And you also hinted in there too about the purpose your practice has served for you over the days and months and years and decades of being this kind of nourishing, nurturing thing. And that's so important in a teaching profession, which does require quite a lot of output of energy. We're working really hard to curate experiences for our students, and while we're there in the room, or while we're creating something online, we're so focused on the experience that they're having. It's really important to have something that we can come back to ourselves to refill our own cup, to rebuild those reserves, and even just to check in to see, how do I feel? Do I feel depleted? How's my energy? How's my body? So to me, those are the two sides, the personal experience to draw from, and that really nourishing way to rebuild the reserves of energy that we tend to give out when we teach.
I think it's important to have both, right? I think
Hmm.
I think my personal practice serves as a resource for my teaching, but I also want it to be a resource for me. And
Yes.
I think this is also the struggle too, because a lot of times as teachers, we come to our personal practice as a way to create and um, you know, things for our classes, especially if you're going and taking a class or taking one online. A lot of times where you can be so busy like taking notes and thinking about what you're going to do with your class that you miss the experience. And for me, if I approach it in that way, I get a lot less out of it, both for myself and for my class. Then if I take the class and really feel into it, not only is it a source of nourishment for me, but I can also then reflect back on, instead of trying to remember every little detail of the class, which would be very robotic for me to teach like that, to try and teach the exact class. I think it's really never copying for me,
Mm.
but it really, and I don't feel that. I feel the same about our students who take our sequences and share them. It's not copying, it's taking it and recognizing the ways in which those things might be helpful for you or your students, and then maybe taking note of that and putting it in your own sequence later. Or I'm usually noting those things like, wow, that was really interesting, it gave me a different experience in my chest, or I feel more stable and confident leaving here. What was it that really helped me feel that way? And so I'm kind of noting those things later, the big
Yeah.
picture things, rather than trying to note every little detail in a class. And so that, again, I get the nourishment for myself, which
Yeah.
is really important as well. And really,
I'm
that nourishment is the resource for my students.
I'm so glad that you pointed that out, because I think for teachers specifically, there is this real dichotomy of, am I using my time on the mat, whether that's guided by somebody else or self-guided? Am I using that to research my next sequence? In which case, I've got my notepad and pen and I'm writing down, oh, that was a great quote. I love that cue, or that fancy transition. And to an extent, you're out of the experience by being in your head, versus just taking it all in, drinking it all in, and seeing
Yeah.
what pops out at the end. And if you don't remember the detail, maybe the detail wasn't the important thing.
Well, and I think this is the beauty of practicing online too, is if like I can get really lost and absorbed in it. And then if I really don't remember and I really want that detail, you could go back and
You can go
rewind.
back.
Like that's why I do think there are a lot of positives to practicing online. Of course, there are things you don't get, like the community and the personal contact. But I think that's one of the pros, is you really can pour yourself into practice. And usually I find that the things that are most important do stand out afterwards. I don't, need to go back, but I can go
Mhm.
back, and then I'm going to put it together in the way that feels relevant. So I might take someone else's class and theme it in a completely different way, because that chest opening for me I felt very confident, and it wasn't about the back bend so much as this other thing maybe that it gave me.
Yeah. Or you have a favorite warm up to prepare you for that thing, or the thing that they did as the peak was the warm up for you, or,
Yeah.
there's
Or the other way
probably
around.
the other way around. Probably more the other way around for me. But yeah, you take bits and pieces. It's like a recipe. You've got the skeleton, but you take bits and pieces and you go, oh, I love paprika with that. Or, oh, that would be so good if I took that inspiration and put that in my grandmother's whatever. The drawing inspiration from and then mixing it in your own way, that's the special sauce that you offer as a teacher.
I love that you just said that too, because I've been like really into cooking shows lately. Anyway,
Doing any
I
cooking or
won't.
just what? Yeah. Okay. We
No, I have been
digress.
cooking. I have been cooking, yes, but we won't divulge. We won't lose our train of thought. But so let's talk about then, like, what constitutes a personal practice, because I think
Yeah.
we're kind of tiptoeing into this already.
And
And
you've already said the thing that I brought out of teacher training with me, which is there's an hour of meditation. And if that's not working, then you've got to do another hour of meditation later. And in my teacher training, it was a list of poses. Every time something came up that we weren't good at or we really wrestled with, they were like, you got to do that every day until it makes sense to you. So I had a big list of things that were not making sense to me or didn't feel right to me. That was going to be my personal practice: the meditation, the pranayama, all the poses that I hated and struggled with. That's like 5 hours of the day. So there is this misconception, or at least to me, it's a misconception, that your personal practice is this elaborate thing. It's this perfectly crafted thing. And if you don't have that, then you're not a good teacher.
yeah, that has to be like the 60-minute practice or a 90-minute practice, which
Minimum.
is so funny how much it's changed now, because it did used to feel that way. Now a 90-minute practice to most people feels like forever, um, especially online. But I think we have to be able to expand that. We come out of teacher training, and even beyond teacher training, we
Yeah.
develop these ideas of what this personal practice should look like. I'm putting should there on purpose. And I think one of the beautiful things about a yoga practice is that it can be so many different things. It can be a mindset. And I mean, I, it can easily feel like a cop out to call it like your yoga practice a mindset, I think, for some people. But I really believe that our practice can show up in many different ways. And I think in some ways the meditation is the hardest, which is, in many ways connected to that mindset. It could be reading, it could be, um, you know, inspirational or philosophical, or that could be studying. But I think to me, a personal practice involves some kind of experience, not just the theoretical, like
Mm.
the reading and the learning, I think is really important. But I think it involves some experience. And I think it's really important as teachers, we get so busy. We're teaching a lot. Now we have to do online classes. So we're maybe on the computer a lot as well, or social media, or whatever it is, coordinating, planning workshops, creating PowerPoints. We're doing all the
Maybe you
things.
also
And
have a real job that you're doing.
yeah. And maybe you're teaching a lot of classes. And so even just finding the energy to do more. And now,
Mm.
everyone's strength training, which is great. I'm glad that people are finally rounding out their practices. and so finding that can be hard. I think taking into context, just as you would your students, a moment of silence there for that to land, what you need. Like, are you already doing a lot of active practices? Do you need more introspective time? Do you need more nourishment? Do you need to like vent and let things go? Like sometimes a movement practice, I think being open to that and allowing it to evolve is really important. It could be a 5-minute meditation practice. It could be a
Yeah.
90-minute vinyasa practice. And that can feel really indulgent and special when you get those moments to do those 90-minute practices, I think then.
Yeah. Yeah. We talked about this a little bit in an early episode, episode 5, sustainability and yoga. I'll link to that in the show notes about what kept us coming back to the mat and what our personal practice looked like and how it had evolved over the years. And I agree with you that it doesn't, certainly not to me, very often look like a 90-minute vinyasa practice. It's, to me, bringing that sense of curiosity, of honest curiosity. What do I really need? What do I actually need compared to all of the other things that I'm doing in my life, whether that is spending 10 hours a day sitting, or whether that is having a really active, physically active life, whether that is experiencing a lot of stress and needing down regulation, or, whatever. What do I actually need? What do I really need? There's that honesty and curiosity, and also a sense of using your practice to create balance with all of your other responsibilities as a householder, as an adult, as a person making your way through the world. So I think a little bit of flexibility in terms of what it looks like and what its duration is really important. And I agree, it can't just be theoretical, it needs to be experiential. And even if that means, you've got this great, perfectly crafted meditation and asana and pranayama practice, and then you walk off your mat and become a complete asshole, that's not yoga, is it? It needs to have some flow on effect into how you move through the world, or at least we should hold that intention. So I kind of feel like we're drawing threads together of experiential, curiosity, balance, and then it having some impact in your daily life. Those to me are all the ingredients of a thoughtful and an intentional personal practice. But for me, that's very rarely 90 minutes on my mat. It's usually 10 to 15 minutes of, often I've been at the desk for a while, I've been all up in my head. I just need to lie down on the ground. Sometimes I'll run my legs up the wall, breathe down into my belly and go, okay, how am I doing? How do I feel? And sometimes that turns into more movement. Often that turns into some strength oriented movement, because upper body strength is the area I need for balance with the rest of my life. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it stays with breath work and visualization. And yeah, that flexibility I think is really important.
I think it's really important to recognize what we need, and sometimes that takes that lens away. I will also say sometimes we have to take that filter away of like what we
Hmm.
think we should have,
What should it
right?
look like?
I will say though, I think there's something really decadent like to having those longer practices. Not that they're needed every day, but you and I are both speaking from a place of having plenty of longer practices in our
Yeah.
past, so that when we have 15 minutes, it's easy to drop into those. Like for someone brand new to just drop in, sure, it can be helpful, but I think having some of those longer practices create a backbone that creates a backbone of like a resource that we can come back to,
Yes.
some familiarity. And even if that's like once a month, I'm
Hmm.
not even going to put a number on it. It's silly to put a number on it, but it does feel really decadent. Like there is more that you can do in 90 minutes. There's more that you can feel into it. But it's not like a prioritization. I mean, I think there's something really beautiful to recognizing that you can get a lot out of a 15-minute practice or a 30-minute practice.
Yeah.
But recognizing, there's some days this summer I was playing tennis for 4 hours, a
Yeah.
day. And it's like, you're not going to go and do, like, it would be totally inappropriate for my body, for my energy, for my
Yeah.
recovery to go and do another active practice. Am I a failure as a yoga teacher? Absolutely not.
Yeah.
I'm now learning how to approach my body with compassion and support and nourishment. And there's what's really cool, I think, about yoga is that it can do so many different things for us, depending on what if we're in an emotionally challenging part of our life. Like there are
Mhm.
emotional resources. If we're in a physically challenging, like maybe we're training for a sport or an event or something, there are all these beautiful athletic tools that we have in, let's just say, recovery. There's a lot more to it. But if I'm in a more stressful part of my work life or relationship life or whatever that might be, there are nervous system resources. Or if I'm sedentary, there are movement resources. Like there's
Mhm.
just so much more to it. And I think anyone listening to this, we have a lot of teachers on here, is familiar. We're not going to talk about all the tools and ways you can use it. But I will say, as someone who's practiced for about 30 years now, is, like being honest with myself is sometimes the hardest part, because we have these fixations on what we should have. Maybe that's meditation for some people, like
Mhm.
it was at the beginning of mine. For others, it's movement, like I have to do an active practice or I have to push myself. And yes, as a human, I need to move. We know that. But like I got to put it in the context of me, just like I would someone I'm working with. And so I think stripping away the ego, the
Yeah.
attachment,
Yeah.
and really being honest with ourselves. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to treat yourself as you would one of your students who
I love that.
you want to love and support, and help. We all feel very compassionate about our students and, have a lot of empathy and support for them. And can you share that with yourself?
Yeah, I love that. And you've drawn out something really important there, which is if you are a teacher and you're not teaching 15-minute classes, you do need to have some legacy experience of what you're teaching to draw from. So if that's a 60-minute class, you do need to know what a 60-minute practice feels like in your body and how high you want to peak and when you are likely to want to rest and what constitutes an appropriate amount of warm up and cool down. All of that sort of stuff. You do need to have that history in your body. And you also need your practice to reflect where you are now. I mean, it's not all that unusual for you to spend a few hours playing tennis. It's not unusual for me to spend a couple of hours hiking. But we're probably talking to people listening for whom that sounds unimaginable. Like to have that time by myself in a day to hike. Oh my God. Those people probably need 90 minutes of uninterrupted vinyasa practice on their own more than they need anything else. Just that refuge to go
I
to.
do love your hiking photos. I'm always very jealous when I see those on your Instagram stories.
I mean, that's a lot of stuff for me. That's some of my movement practice. That's some of my meditation practice. That's my gratitude practice. So it ticks a lot of boxes for me, and it's uninterrupted time on my own, which a lot of people don't get. So I think it is really important to spell out that if you're a teacher, you definitely need to know how it feels to take your own class and to have that history in your body to teach from. But also, your practice needs to reflect what your life actually looks and feels like now, not our list, but your list.
And I want to say this too, because I remember too, for a long time, as maybe the first decade of teaching for me or something, hearing people say things like this, and this idea of like my hiking or my tennis being my yoga, as like I always felt like it felt like cheating, or like just trying to check the box without doing the work. And I do think that, like, for everyone, like hiking isn't necessary, like it can be a different thing, right? It does, like you say, it does require that we have some experience with the practice. It's not like
Mhm,
all I'm doing is playing tennis and that's my yoga practice, or all you're doing is hiking and that's your yoga practice. But that we can bring that into it, and as humans we find a way to evolve and support ourselves in the way that is most relevant and helpful. And sometimes that means the most efficient. And I mean, I love that. Like, I really love that now, like it's pretty well felt, I think, across the yoga verse, that you can do a 30-minute vinyasa practice and get it pretty well rounded. You're not going to get really deep or nothing anything crazy probably, but you can get a pretty nice well-rounded practice to balance
mhm,
out your day. And you know maybe we do need to challenge ourselves more, especially in menopause and perimenopause, and that we have conditioning on our site to kind of find
mhm,
some more challenges, I think. But I can look at that, like for us, taking that yoga conditioning and putting on our site was a way of acknowledging that our body, the wellness of our body, does demand a little bit more, but we can bring some of the nuance of mindfulness and awareness in the body into those conditioning practices, and some more than others. But I think there is this stream of yoga that we can bring into many different things, brushing our teeth, going on a hike. That doesn't mean we don't still have practices, of course. I think those are the moments we dip in deep, we dive in and really get that nourishment on the mat.
I've definitely had some interactions with newer teachers or teachers who are going through the process of teacher training and they're observing my class or something. I've definitely had some interactions where I'm getting that vibe of uh, you talking about hiking as part of your practice is a cop out. You're cheating. And fortunately, I have just rock solid self esteem. That stuff bounces right off me because the important thing is not what they think, it's what I know. And so that's where bringing that real honesty to your practice is crucial. You'll know if you're copping out. If you're really honest with yourself, you'll know
Yeah.
whether you are bypassing the things that are difficult for you, that are challenging for you, just to do the things you like. You'll know that if you're really honest with yourself.
Well, and my point is, I think that can be a mindset that keeps people from evolving and letting their practice shape
Agreed.
to
Agreed.
meet them. I did Ashtanga for a long time, and there's like this mentality, and I'm sure not everyone has it, but I had it of like, you had to be on your mat
Yeah.
6 days a week.
Yeah.
And you had to do, the full series. And like, it was just like a thing you had to do. And I think there's an importance to that. In my 20s, I really needed that discipline. It was really, that was a resource for me. And I can see that and acknowledge that now. But at some point I also got injured and was forced to, and this is my personal journey, of course, everyone's is different, but I had to evolve and find ways to, I was forced to find ways to find, to find ways to support myself with my practice. And so, I think it's important to have that flexibility of mind as well, and to not feel like a failure because, you're not doing a 90-minute physical practice, because
Yeah.
there's so much more to yoga, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's so silly to say that now out loud, but these are the pressures we all put on ourselves, and we're all human. So we all experience these pressures, and, this evolution, I think, of our practice, which brings us to like frequency too,
Yes.
like,
Yeah. I was heading
does
straight
frequency
into
matter?
every damn day. As soon as you started talking about the 6 days a week, I was like, let's call that out. Does it need to be an everyday practice?
And I think I think my opinion is, for me, and I love this about Ferdowsa's classes that she has with us on, decolonization of yoga and politics, and her book clubs, and she's always talking about this. But there's always like this looming of like, what is yoga? And for me, yoga is so many things, but one of many of them is this listening, and this source of self compassion and self nourishment. And so for me, it's every day in the sense that I'm always checking in and listening, and it's always there in some form. Like, most days I'm meditating in the morning and or doing breath work, some combination of those two usually. But some days, on a weekend, it feels nice to read a book and journal, and I'm not going to, I think it's a fine line, as I kind of came from the Ashtanga method of the last 20 years. And there's a fine line, because you do want that. I know, at least I do crave that routine and that continuity, and not having to think about what I'm doing that day, but just having a routine to go through. Whereas at the same time, that openness to listening and allowing it to be flexible, to me, there's a very fine line. Everyone's different. Some people can really live in that ambiguity and flexibility and like do whatever every day. But I think for me, it's kind of like having that time in the morning, especially to check in, whatever that means. Most of the time, that's meditation and pranayama for me. But, I think that can show up in a lot of different ways. That for some people it could be 5 minutes, it could be 2 minutes, it could be 30 minutes, or it could be a formal asana practice. I don't think there's anything wrong with taking time off, though.
Yeah.
I just
Yeah.
think for me, I like to have some touch point.
We are definitely doing the yoga medicine thing where if you tuned into this podcast hoping for 5 easy ways to create your daily personal practice, you're not going to get that. We're going to make you do
Sorry.
the actual work of really thinking about what it means to you and what you need. And I couldn't agree more. There are phases of life, definitely have been in mine, probably will be in most people's lives, where structure and routine and discipline are self-care, are affirming
Mm.
are exactly what you need to ground and center you. I'm not in that phase right now. And I don't start my day with reflection and pranayama and meditation. Usually I wake up as late as I possibly can to get to my first appointment. I only leave time for coffee. And that's what works for me. When I do usually have time is mid-afternoon. And that's where, my inspiration and my energy start to dip. I usually have unscheduled time, and that's my time to go, okay, how am I doing today? What do I need today? How am I really feeling? What's really going on for me? So like you, I need that daily check-in of how am I doing? What's my temperature? What are my vital signs like? And sometimes that does turn into physical practice. Sometimes that turns into lying on the floor and breathing. Sometimes I'm rolling around on myofascial balls or
Mm.
doing some upper body strength and some core strength. And it can look different for different people, and it looks different at different phases of life. So if you're in that phase of really needing structure and discipline and routine, great. If you're not,
Yeah.
also great.
And I'll say too, like my practice has changed so much over the years. And
Same,
I've had a lot of times too where I've felt like I was forcing myself. Like again, I go
same.
back to this like you have to meditate. And I start to catch myself doing that and I'll take a break from it because
Yeah.
I think there's something um, that really holds us back when we feel like this rigidity around it. There's not the curiosity and the nuance and the nourishment. And for me, I really have to step back, even if that means not practicing for a week. I mean,
Hmm.
it's pretty hard for me not to. I think mostly because I'd like to do some like yin after sports and things like there's always some of it, right? Or MFR or like it always sneaks in usually a few ways in my day. But for me, it's important that now at this phase of my life, which has evolved a lot, that it's there as a resource, as something that I'm using to support myself with, rather than something that I have to do. And I
Hmm.
think that helps us as teachers too to to teach from a place of appreciation rather than what we can
Yes.
also get as burnout. I think when you're constantly pushing and forcing and it's just a really different way of seeing things.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with this more, especially for teachers, because I do talk to people in training who are so deep in the learning process that they're losing some of the joy of the practice. And I do think that's just a phase that you go through in teacher training. There's so much to
Yeah.
take in and there's so much learning. You're dissecting something that you really loved and enjoyed without perhaps thinking about it too deeply. But when you want to teach for the long term, it can't be on your list of have to, should, because then you really do burn out. You really do lose what
Yeah.
drew you back to your mat in the first place. So I agree. For me, it's really important that it doesn't hit the got to do or should do list. And if it does, then I do the same. I back off, I take a break, and I think about what actually draws me in. What do I want to do? What do I enjoy doing? Which maybe brings us to the next topic is, should your practice be the stuff you need, or should your practice be the stuff you like and want? What are your thoughts on
Mm.
that?
I mean, I think it's really both.
Yeah.
I I think for me, the need becomes more prominent when I have really clear needs. When it's not clear, then I kind of go with more of what I like. And I think for me, though, I also think I've kind of trained myself to really like the things that are hard, whether that's my muscles are weak in certain ranges of motion or limited in certain range of motions, or I'm mentally challenged in certain things. For me, those are the interesting areas. Those are the things where those are the growth points. Um and I mean, like, there's also the feel good side of like, oh my God, there's nothing better than an upper back opener after a lot of racket sports. It's like
Yeah.
that's also feel good, but it's also needed. And so, I mean, I think you're talking too about the things that we like, meaning the things that we're really good at. Like maybe you're really
Yeah.
bendy and you just love those yin classes versus doing the strength work.
Yeah.
Um, but I think people who have taken training with us over time also hopefully have followed that shift. Like I knew you have too of what I was
Yes.
just talking about of shifting what you like to maybe be what you need.
100%. Yeah, I agree. I think we've all been through phases of, I'm really good at the stretchy stuff, so that's going to be my practice. But I do think if you do that for a while, you stop feeling the benefit. I know I do. If I go full range of motion in yin, my joints hurt. It's hard for me to walk afterwards. So while it might feel good for a moment, it doesn't really feel good for long. And so I do find myself liking the things that are better for me long term. Now, that said, if it's core strength, there are 10 things on the core strength list that I don't like to do and I don't do. But I can find alternatives. I can find a different 10 things that feel interesting and engaging and creative. So it doesn't just mean doing the stuff I hate. It means finding versions of the things that are good for me that I relish and enjoy.
But I think, like me, we're both very similar in the sense. I think when it comes to core is a great example to something like core, which you just say core and it does sound kind of, it could to some sound boring, like you're doing
Right.
crunches and bicycles and
Right.
things like that. But I think a lot of what we do at Yoga Medicine and on our platform too is get curious to like what's important about the core. Like how do I
Yes.
translate that into movement and into movements that relate to my life? And like then it's interesting. Then I start to feel how to support myself through gravity and that I'm curious and that's fun. So
Exactly.
you
Exactly. So
can
that
turn it
that
into a life. And you do
that's
turn it
right.
into likes.
And I mean, it's the same with any aspect of our health. Like if you think, well, I want to eat healthy, and you hate kale and give yourself a whole plate of kale, you know that's not going to last. You know that's not sustainable. But if you can
Yeah.
find ways to incorporate foods that are really nutrient dense and nourishing in ways that you also enjoy, that's the pathway forward. That's the most sustainable way to get what you need in a way that you also like.
Well, and you just touched on it too. Like in healthcare, we know the best outcomes are going to be from the things that we can stick with long term.
Right?
Those short term things that we do are going to be a blip on the road, of our health and wellness. The same is true with yoga. So, like you're saying, finding those things that you like enough to keep your practice regular. But I think getting curious to the things, maybe turning some of the needs into likes too. And
Hmm.
some of that is just changing the lens. We've talked kind of been alluding to this all the way through the lens through which we see our practice to, see our practice as a source of nourishment, as a way of supporting ourselves, whether that be through the challenge or through the introspection. And then it kind of changes those needs into likes. And so it's not just like, am I being greedy or am I being supportive? It's like, yeah, it's kind of both. So
Yeah. What are your thoughts on, can your personal practice be led by a teacher, or do you have to craft your own? What's your opinion there?
I like both. I mean, there are
Hmm.
some days where I'm like really clear in what I want and need. And sometimes I just take my own class online too, because I know what's in it. And that sounds really goofy. And I used to hate listening to I could never watch my videos for like years and years and years at the beginning. But it's been like 15 years now online and I can do that
You're used
now.
to
I'm
it.
okay with it. I'm used to it. And I know what's in it. Um, and sometimes there's something else. So sometimes a self-guided practice is really great for me. But some days I'm just, like my brain's full. I don't
Yeah.
want to think. Like maybe there's something I want, so I search for it on the site. Maybe I just like don't want to think about it. So I go to our weekly lineup or the featured class and just like whatever I pick, if you go in an in-person class, you're gonna get something out of it anyways, right? So I try not to ruminate on the selection process. I'll take a few minutes to look around and then I just make myself choose. But
Hmm.
I think both. I mean, sometimes I know what I want and I'm guiding myself, or I'm just feeling into that interoceptive awareness, and some days I just want to be led.
Yeah.
What about
Yeah,
you?
I couldn't agree more. And I think we're already kind of drawing towards some major takeaways for people who are looking for tips for their personal practice. And the first one is, it really is important. It's important if you're teaching as a resource to draw from. But if you're not teaching, it's still an important way that you can nourish yourself and care for yourself and create balance in the busyness of life. We talked about frequency, and we didn't say this, which is rare for yoga medicine, but little and often is usually our kind of mantra for things. If you can only carve out 90 minutes once a week or once a month, that's better than nothing. But if you can get those little drops, even the little daily check ins that we were talking about, that moment of honest reflection of how am I really doing? And what do I actually need? That's where your practice starts to have those big compound effects, because
Yeah.
you're kind of nipping things in the bud. You're getting in early as opposed to waiting to overwhelm.
And just because we haven't really talked about it yet, I'll just add in briefly. Like I really believe, based on what we know about the body, the nervous system, the tissues, all of the things, that, just like 15 minutes a day is going to be more impactful than 90 minutes once a week.
Mm-hmm.
So finding small things, and that could be 5 minutes a day for you. That could be 30 minutes a day for you, whatever you can easily commit to, something that start overly realistic and then you can increase it from there. If 10 minutes feels like really realistic to you, start with that. Don't
I got
overcommit,
plenty
start a
of 10-minute
routine.
classes on yoga medicine
Yeah.
online. It's totally possible to get a good practice in 10 minutes. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, little and often commit to something that's realistic. We talked about prioritizing poses and practices that you need versus those that you like. And we both agree that you're really looking for the overlap between the two. And I think the more honest and the more curious you get in your practice, the more likely you are to find that the things that you need can become the things that you like, that you relish. We talked about kind of setting aside rules of shoulds and have tos of, it doesn't have to be this particular duration. It doesn't have to be this elaborate thing that you imagined, but it's this process of curiosity of figuring out what you need from today, which could be 10 minutes guided by somebody, or it could be 30 minutes rolling around on the floor.
And we talked about combining that with like the level of structure that you need. So,
Mm-hmm.
if that overwhelms you to feel like it could be anything, like find the amount of structure you need. That might just be like from 8 to 8:10 every morning, I'm going to do something. Or it could be from 8 to 8:10 every morning, I'm going to meditate. Or like let it be as specific and structured as you need to, but also because I know sometimes just being open can be like too much too.
Yeah, I agree. And again, that really requires you to be honest about what's going to be the most useful option, the option that you are most likely to commit to and do.
I also think sometimes discerning between a movement practice versus a more introspective practice can be hard because we all end up at our computers probably longer than we want to and end up being more sedentary like than we want to be. But we also get tired and need that nourishment of introspection as well. And so sometimes I think the easiest way to think about it is to consider, okay, if I were to pull myself together and do a more active practice, would I feel better or worse at the end of it? Because sometimes like I can think about it and be like, oh yeah, I know I am going to feel better if I push myself and move a little bit right now, even though there's kind of like that heaviness and sedentariness sometimes from sitting too, versus like knowing. I think a lot of times, especially as if you've been practicing for a bit, there is a knowing of like, oh no, I really need the nourishment. I feel like I might be a little bit, and sometimes you don't know without trying, so trial and error, get to know and experiment. But I think just sensing like, am I going to feel better or worse if I do a really active practice? Um, and then it's like, oh, maybe I do need more of the nourishment. Maybe I need to slow down because I can overthink it sometimes of like, how much activity have I done? Maybe I need more. Maybe I need like, there's just so much in our heads. And so I think sometimes that can be an easy way to consider.
And I think that's a really beautiful way to kind of wrap up, is because it's how we started by talking about how the brain can get in the way, especially for people who listen to this kind of podcast. You're probably people who think a lot about yoga and, love the research and love to learn and love to dive into the nitty gritty. And sometimes your brain can actually stop you from getting what you need. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why yoga is an experiential practice and not a theoretical one.
And I'm just going to end with a few points that you had actually written down that I think we don't need to like talk on, but it's a good reminder, tying it into like if you're struggling just to get the habit, because we've kind of talked to a bunch of the barriers a little bit more from a teacher's angle, but I think also teacher or not, um, tying it into existing habits,
Hmm.
whether that's like when you're feeling a lull in your workday, or maybe after athletic endeavors or training, or after dropping your kids off at school. Like if you can tie it into something to create a ritual, um, reducing barriers by maybe having things ready to go. Maybe you have, everything in a place. Maybe there's, some attractiveness that you can create around it, like props you like. I love this. You put scented candles or music, like joining an online challenge, or we have the ability to put it in your calendar, which can make it really nice. And you can invite a friend, which is really nice too. So there can be that camaraderie around it. So there are also ways just to kind of help. And again, if you're having trouble just creating the routine, again, just start really simple, like 10 minutes Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or something that's
Hmm.
easily attainable. And again, maybe inviting someone, whether that's an in-person class, or I love the invite a friend invitation on our site, because you guys can then practice together.
Yeah.
It's nice.
I love that. And if you are looking for tips on how to establish a regular practice, I did a whole podcast with this on Alison Heilig, which was about creating change. So if you're looking for ways to set a positive habit that feels easier and more achievable, creating more realistic expectations and a more supportive environment, I'll link to that episode in the show notes if you're looking for that kind of advice.
And I'll also mention too, I just did, if you're on our subscription site, if you practice with us online, I just did a monthly dose on supporting your personal practice, which was actually beyond different than what we talked about today, and really looking at how to use our platform and more specifics around building a personal practice, whether you're online, whether you're new or not. So we did cover some different things there. And if you're not a member, we have a free trial, so you can check it out and listen to just a short lecture there about other ways to support your personal practice.
So stop making it hard and make it as easy as you can. And then you're more likely to actually do it and get the benefits. And it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy of the more you do and the better you feel, the more likely you are to come back to that practice again.
Right. Yeah. And allow your mind to be flexible so that you can see this practice as a source of nourishment. I think that's one of the big takeaways for myself over the decades, getting out of your own way and taking what you need. So lots of great takeaways. We hope it's been helpful. Let us know in the comments, or maybe if you're taking classes with us online, you can always comment there as well. We love seeing those, or on social media, wherever you go, or YouTube if you're watching it, the video. And we will see you next time. Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.